In 1938, a young woman walked into Buckingham Palace, curtsied before the King and Queen of England, and smiled for the cameras. She was beautiful, poised, and seemingly destined for greatness as a member of America's most powerful family. 3 years later, that same woman would be strapped to an operating table, fully awake, while doctors cut into her brain. She would never walk properly again. She would never speak clearly again, and for 20 years, her own family would pretend she didn't exist. Her name was Rosemary Kennedy, and this is the story they didn't want you to know. Welcome to WhistleForce. Please like the video. Rosemary Kennedy, known as Rosemary, was born on September 13, 1918. She was the eldest daughter born to Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. She came into the world during one of the most dangerous pandemics in modern history, the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918. And from the very first moments of her life, things went terribly wrong. During her birth, the doctor was not immediately available because of an outbreak of the Spanish influenza epidemic, and the nurse ordered Rose Kennedy to keep her legs closed, forcing the baby's head to stay in the birth canal for 2 hours. The action resulted in a harmful loss of oxygen. 2 hours. 2 hours of oxygen deprivation in the most critical moments of a newborn's life. Rosemary may have suffered from a birth complication known as a hypoxic ischemic injury, which occurs when the brain doesn't receive enough oxygen during the birthing process. However, when the child was allowed to be born, nothing unusual was noticed. Born with bright eyes, amicable smile, and iconic dark hair, Rosemary seemed to be a normal child. But as she began to grow up, her parents realized she was different. As Rosemary began to grow, her parents noticed she was not reaching the basic developmental steps, normally reached at a certain month or year. At 2 years old, she had a hard time sitting up, crawling, and learning to walk. She was slower to crawl, slower to walk, and to speak than her brothers, and she experienced learning difficulties when she reached school age. But here's what's important to understand. The Kennedy household was not an ordinary household. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was one of the wealthiest men in America, a businessman, an investor, and a man with enormous political ambitions. He saw his children not just as his family, but as instruments of a dynasty he was determined to build. Every Kennedy child was expected to be exceptional. Every Kennedy child was expected to win. The Kennedy siblings were competitive and their parents demanded much of them. This sort of lifestyle provided many challenges for Rosemary, who grew frustrated that she could not live up to the accomplishments of her siblings. It was only once her younger sisters began to pass her developmentally that they realized something was different about Rosemary. Although a few theories exist, the cause of Rosemary's intellectual challenges is unknown. Research into intellectual disabilities was not advanced in the early 20th century. Methods for diagnosis, education, and treatment were underdeveloped. Moreover, a stigma against people with intellectual and physical disabilities was widespread. And this stigma, this crushing weight of social judgment, is crucial to understanding what would eventually happen to Rosemary. In the early 20th century, having a child with an intellectual disability was considered shameful. It was considered a reflection of bad genetics, of something wrong with the family line. For a family like the Kennedys, who were building an empire, who were planning to put their sons in the White House, this was seen as an existential threat. Rose and Joe Kennedy had little advice they could turn to for how best to raise Rosemary. They decided that she would benefit from remaining at home. As Joe said, "What can they do in an institution that we can't do better for her at home here with her family?" Institutionalization was a common response to intellectual disability at the time, but the Kennedys kept her at home. Rosemary lived with her family during most of her childhood, which included some very public years during the 1930s, when her father was U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom. To their credit, Rose and Joe Kennedy did try, in their own way, to help their daughter. The Kennedys also involved her with regular family routines and activities. Rose called her an affectionate, warmly responsive, and loving girl. She was so willing to try to do her best, so appreciative of attention and compliments, and so hopeful of deserving them. Rosemary wasn't just a girl with challenges. She was a young woman with dreams, with feelings, with a deep desire to be accepted. She wanted to make her parents proud. She wanted to be like her siblings, and in many ways, she succeeded in ways that history has overlooked. Diaries written by her in the late 1930s and published in the 1980s reveal a young woman whose life was filled with outings to the opera, tea dances, dress fittings, and other social interests. Being a teenager in the Kennedy family involved an active life full of sports and social occasions. In her free time, Rosemary enjoyed shopping for new clothes, going to dances, and spending time with friends. When Eunice Kennedy Shriver was growing up, her sister Rosemary didn't seem any different from her other siblings. Rosemary loved to play and swim and sail, enjoying and excelling at all the outdoor sports. Eunice also loved. But in the outside world, Rosemary's diagnosis was met with prejudice and stigma. When Rosemary's parents tried to find the right school for her, they found closed hearts and closed doors. People saw no future for someone with intellectual disabilities. Experts advised that attempts at education would be a waste of time and bring only disappointment. As Rosemary grew into a teenager, her parents searched desperately for schools that could help her. During her teenage years, her parents sent her to several private boarding schools. They chose schools that offered special support for students with intellectual challenges. Some offered better programs for Rosemary than others, although the frequent changes of school presented additional hardships for her. At age 16, Kennedy was sent to the Sacred Heart Convent in Elmhurst, Providence, Rhode Island, where she was educated separately from the other students. 2 nuns and a special teacher, Miss Newton, worked with her all day in a separate classroom. The Kennedys gave the school a new tennis court for their efforts. Her reading, writing, spelling, and counting skills were reported to be at a 4th grade level. But the Kennedy machine kept moving, and Joseph Kennedy Sr. was determined that his daughter would not become a liability to the family's image, so they created a facade. They told the public a carefully constructed story. Kennedy's parents told Woman's Day that she was studying to be a kindergarten teacher, and Parents was told that while she had an interest in social welfare work, she is said to harbor a secret longing to go on the stage. When the Boston Globe requested an interview with Rosemary, her father's assistant prepared a response which Rosemary copied out laboriously. The family worked hard to create the illusion of normalcy. During this period, her mother arranged for her older brother John to accompany her to a tea dance. Thanks to him, she appeared not different at all during the dance. And then came the pinnacle of Rosemary's public life. In 1938, when Joe Kennedy was serving as the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom, something remarkable happened. In 1938, Kennedy was presented as a debutante to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace during her father's service as the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom. Kennedy practiced the complicated royal curtsy for hours. Picture this moment: a young woman from an Irish-American family, standing in Buckingham Palace, curtsying before the King and Queen of England. Rosemary Kennedy did this. Despite everything, despite all her challenges, she stood in that palace and she performed that curtsy beautifully. It should have been a triumph. It should have been proof that with the right support, Rosemary could thrive. Rosemary, Joe, and Rose Kennedy's strikingly beautiful eldest daughter attended exclusive schools, was presented as a debutante to the Queen and King of England, and traveled the world with her high-spirited sisters and brothers. Yet, Rosemary was intellectually disabled, a secret fiercely guarded by her powerful and glamorous family. While in England, she was enrolled in a convent school with a Montessori program, a place where she found great comfort and stability. Although happy at school, the start of World War II caused the Kennedy family to return to America, and this is where everything began to unravel. Once the Kennedys returned to the United States, Rosemary did not find a similar positive environment to what she had in England. Now an adult, she did not understand why she could not live as free of a life as that of her siblings and grew more rebellious and assertive. But when the family returned to the United States in 1940, Rosemary was not making progress, but seemed instead to be going backward. As her sister Eunice later wrote, at 22, she was becoming increasingly irritable and difficult. According to her sister Eunice, Rosemary Kennedy's behavior became more troubling after returning from the United Kingdom in 1940. When she was 22, she suffered convulsions and sudden violent outbursts, sometimes lashing out and injuring those around her. She was expelled from a summer camp in Massachusetts, spent only a short time at a Philadelphia boarding school, and was eventually placed in a convent school in Washington, D.C. Back at home, Rosemary watched her siblings begin their lives and careers, while she wasn't even allowed outside alone. Rose tried to find another school for her daughter, but few places were equipped to take a disabled adult in her 20s. Rosemary was eventually sent to a convent, where she began sneaking out at night and going to bars. Think about what Rosemary was experiencing. She was a young woman in her early 20s. Her brothers were starting careers. Her sisters were dating and attending social events. And Rosemary was watched constantly, restricted endlessly, never allowed the freedom that every young person craves. Her frustration is not difficult to understand. Her rebellion makes complete sense. After being expelled from a summer camp in western Massachusetts and staying only a few months at a Philadelphia boarding school, Kennedy was sent to a convent school in Washington, D.C. Kennedy began sneaking out of the convent school at night. The nuns at the convent thought that Rosemary might be involved with sexual partners and that she could contract a sexually transmitted disease or become pregnant. Her occasionally erratic behavior frustrated her parents. Her father was especially worried that Kennedy's behavior would shame and embarrass the family and damage his and his children's political careers. And there it was, the calculation, the cold political calculation that would seal Rosemary's fate. Joseph Kennedy Sr. wasn't just worried about his daughter. He was worried about what his daughter might do to his son's political futures. He was building a dynasty, and in his mind, Rosemary was becoming a threat to that dynasty. Joe Sr. was busy plotting the political career of his two oldest sons, wanting to avoid scandal and looking to find a cure for his daughter's erratic behavior. He began speaking to Dr. Walter Freeman and his associate Dr. James Watts, the leading practitioners of lobotomies in America. At the time, the procedure was heralded as a cure for the physically disabled and mentally ill. Now we need to understand who Walter Freeman was and what a lobotomy actually meant. At the peak of his career, Walter J. Freeman, too, was a celebrated physician and scientist. He served as the first chairman of the Department of Neurology at George Washington University and was a tireless advocate of surgical treatment for mental illness. His eccentric appearance, engaging personality during interviews, and theatrical demonstrations of his surgical techniques gained him substantial popularity with local and national media, and he performed more than 3,000 prefrontal and transorbital lobotomies between 1930 and 1960. After 4 decades, Freeman had personally performed possibly as many as 4,000 lobotomies on patients as young as 4, despite the fact that he had no formal surgical training. As many as 100 of his patients died of cerebral hemorrhage, and he was banned from performing surgery in 1967. While Freeman's work found many supporters, his courting of the media reflected an arrogance and recklessness that placed many people's lives and health at risk. Of the 3,500 lobotomies he performed or supervised during his career, an estimated 490 individuals died as a result of the treatment. His attitude and fatality rate, combined with his lack of interest in describing a scientific basis for the procedure, left him with little authority in the medical community. At the time, it was seen as a possible treatment for severe mental illness, but within a few years, lobotomy was labeled one of the most barbaric mistakes of modern medicine. Its use increased dramatically from the early 1940s and into the 1950s. By 1951, almost 20,000 lobotomies had been performed in the U.S. and proportionally more in the United Kingdom. More lobotomies were performed on women than on men. A 1951 study found that nearly 60% of American lobotomy patients were women. The procedure was devastating. The frontal lobotomy procedure could have severe negative effects on a patient's personality and ability to function independently. Lobotomy patients often show a marked reduction in initiative and inhibition. They may also exhibit difficulty imagining themselves in the position of others because of decreased cognition and detachment from society. Walter Freeman coined the term surgically induced childhood and used it constantly to refer to the results of lobotomy. The operation left people with an infantile personality. Joseph Kennedy heard about this procedure. He heard promises that it could calm his daughter, stop her mood swings, make her more manageable, and he made a decision that would haunt the Kennedy family forever. Rose and Joe were smart enough to know that there might be mental health issues going on with Rosemary, because they did investigate placing her in a psychiatric institution in the fall of 1941, and those records are here in the library. They ended up not doing that. I'm not clear why, but they were aware that she had some mental health issues. Joe Sr. discussed the procedure with Rose, who asked their daughter Kathleen to look into it. Kathleen spoke with a reporter, John White, investigating mental illness and treatments. White told Kathleen that the effects of lobotomies were no good. According to historian Kate Clifford Larson, Kathleen immediately reported back to her mother. "Oh, Mother, no. It's nothing we want done for Rosie. But whether out of desperation or determination, Joe Sr. went ahead with the surgery. Joe Sr. decided that Rosemary should have a lobotomy. However, he did not inform his wife of this decision until after the procedure was completed. The procedure took place in November 1941. Despite pleas from Rosemary's siblings not to pursue the procedure, Joseph approved the surgery, which Freeman performed with neurosurgery department head James Watts, without telling his wife, Rosemary's siblings, and, allegedly, even Rosemary herself. Particularly haunting is the fact that we don't know if Rosemary herself was told about the surgery beforehand. Would she have even resisted the girl who wanted nothing more than to make her parents happy? What happened in that operating room in November 1941 is almost unbearable to describe. In Ronald Kessler's 1996 biography of Joe Sr., Sins of the Father, James W. Watts, who carried out the procedure with Walter Freeman, is quoted, "After Rosemary was mildly sedated, we went through the top of the head," Dr. Watts recalled. "I think she was awake. She had a mild tranquilizer. I made a surgical incision in the brain through the skull. It was near the front. It was on both sides. We just made a small incision, no more than an inch. For example, he asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer, or sing God Bless America, or count backward. We made an estimate on how far to cut based on how she responded. When Rosemary began to become incoherent, they stopped. They stopped when she became incoherent. They stopped when the young woman who had curtsied before kings could no longer form words. They stopped when the damage was already done. It was immediately clear that the operation had drastically failed. Rosemary had lost most of her ability to walk or talk. Her personality had been forever altered and she was left physically disabled. The operation on the frontal lobes of Rosemary's brain caused terrible damage. She stopped speaking, started mumbling, and stared at walls for hours on end. She was institutionalized in a private psychiatric hospital in New York for several years. She was extremely disabled. She had to learn to walk and dress herself and move, basically, in the months after the surgery. She never regained full speech ability. She really lost most of her ability to function as an individual and an independent person the rest of her life. At 23 years old, Rosemary Kennedy, the girl who loved to dance, who enjoyed shopping for clothes, who had been presented to royalty, was reduced to someone who could barely walk, barely speak, barely function. And what did her family do? In Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter, author Kate Clifford Larson stated that Kennedy's lobotomy was hidden from the family for 20 years. None of her siblings knew of her whereabouts. Rosemary Kennedy spent the rest of her life alone in institutions. Her family did not visit her until 20 years after the operation. 20 years. For 20 years, Rosemary Kennedy's own brothers and sisters didn't know where she was. For 20 years, her mother didn't see her face. For 20 years, this young woman lived in institutional care, away from everyone who had ever loved her, while her family built their political empire without her. After being released from the hospital, Rosemary was immediately institutionalized. Rosemary spent most of the rest of her life at St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin. At St. Coletta, she received personalized attention and therapy, although she was mainly isolated from her family. In 1949, she was moved into a private house on the grounds at the St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin. Rosemary lived there for the remainder of her long life, and meanwhile, the Kennedy family continued to rise. John F. Kennedy was elected to Congress, then to the Senate. He launched a presidential campaign, and throughout all of it, Rosemary was the family secret that had to be kept hidden at all costs. While her older brother John was campaigning for re-election to the U.S. Senate in 1958, the Kennedy family explained away her absence by claiming she was reclusive. The family did not publicly explain her absence until 1961. After John had been elected president, the Kennedys did not reveal that she was institutionalized because of a failed lobotomy, but instead said that she was deemed mentally retarded. Bertram S. Brown, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, who was previously an aide to President Kennedy, told Kessler that Joe Kennedy referred to his daughter Rosemary as mentally retarded rather than mentally ill in order to protect John's reputation for a presidential run, and that the family's lack of support for mental illness is part of a lifelong family denial of what was really so. Watts told Kessler that in his opinion, Kennedy did not have mental retardation, but rather a form of depression. A review of all of the papers written by the two doctors confirmed Watts's declaration. All of the patients the two doctors lobotomized were diagnosed as having some form of mental disorder, so the truth was buried beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. Rosemary didn't have an intellectual disability that required institutionalization. She had mental health challenges that, today, could likely be treated with medication and therapy. But in 1941, her father chose to cut into her brain, and for the rest of her life, she paid the price for that decision. In 1961, after Joe Sr. had a stroke that left him unable to speak and walk, Rosemary's siblings were made aware of her location. It took Joseph Kennedy Sr. suffering a stroke, losing his own ability to speak and walk, just as his daughter had, for the truth to finally come out to his other children. There is a kind of terrible poetry in that. Rosemary's condition was revealed publicly by her sister Eunice in a 1962 interview to the Saturday Evening Post, but her lobotomy did not become public knowledge until 1987, when historian Doris Kearns Goodwin revealed it in her book The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys. It was Eunice Kennedy Shriver, Rosemary's younger sister, who shared the family secret with the world in 1962, when she wrote about her sister in the Saturday Evening Post. Shriver's decision to tell Rosemary's story was brave, but what appeared in print was only partially true. Shriver did not mention the lobotomy or its horrible aftermath. Why not? Was she haunted by feelings of responsibility or shame for that fateful decision made by her parents? Was she protecting the Kennedy family? Whatever Shriver's reasons for telling Rosemary's story as she did, the result was heart-wrenching. "It fills me with sadness," Eunice wrote, "to think this change might not have been necessary if we knew then what we know today." Coletta's in Jefferson, Wisconsin, where Rosemary spent the last 50 years of her life, she recoiled when she saw her mother for the first time. She knew her mother was. She knew that she hadn't seen her mother. Did she blame her mother for the lobotomy? I'm not really sure. Did she blame her father? Not really sure. That hasn't been recorded, but certainly pain and anger and anguish were part of her lived experience, and that all came flooding back to her when she saw her mother. After decades of silence, Rosemary Kennedy saw her mother again, and she recoiled. Whatever memories remained in her damaged brain, whatever feelings she could still process, she recoiled from the woman who had let this happen to her. Following her father's death in 1969, the Kennedys gradually involved Rosemary in family life again. She was occasionally taken to visit relatives in Florida and Washington, D.C., as well as her childhood home on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. By that time, Rosemary had learned to walk again, but did so with a limp. She never regained the ability to speak clearly, and her arm was palsied. Over time, the family reconnected with Rosemary. After her father's death in 1969, her siblings began including her in family gatherings again. But here is where this story takes a turn that transforms tragedy into something unexpected, something that would change millions of lives around the world. Eunice Kennedy Shriver, founder of Special Olympics, was a pioneer in the worldwide struggle for rights and acceptance for people with intellectual disabilities. Eunice Kennedy Shriver believed in justice. But in the late 1950s and early 1960s, she saw little justice in the way people with intellectual disabilities were treated. She saw they were excluded and routinely placed in custodial institutions. They were often ignored and neglected. Yet she knew they had many talents and gifts to offer. Eunice Kennedy Shriver had a sister, Rosemary, who had an intellectual disability. Eunice Kennedy Shriver believed that if people with intellectual disabilities were given the same opportunities and experiences as everyone else, they could accomplish far more than anyone ever thought possible. She put that vision into action in 1962 by inviting young people with intellectual disabilities to a summer day camp she hosted in her backyard. She called it Camp Shriver. The goal was to explore the children's skills in a variety of sports and physical activities. The idea behind that first Camp Shriver began to grow. In July 1968, the first International Special Olympics Games were held in Chicago, Illinois, USA. That year, the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., Foundation helped to plan and fund the first International Special Olympics Summer Games, held in Chicago's Soldier Field, where 1,000 athletes with intellectual disabilities from 26 states and Canada competed. In her speech at the opening ceremony, Shriver said, "The Chicago Special Olympics prove a very fundamental fact, the fact that exceptional children, mentally disabled children, can be exceptional athletes, the fact that through sports they can realize their potential for growth." Special Olympics, Inc. was established as a non-profit charity in 1968. Since that time, nearly 3 million athletes have participated. Shriver nationalized the Special Olympics, a sports organization conceived for persons with intellectual disabilities, for her efforts on behalf of disabled people. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1984. Rosemary's ordeal was the fuel that powered the engine that was Eunice Kennedy Shriver. Historian Eileen McNamara told the PBS NewsHour, "I think there was some guilt that she was complicit in some way in letting Rosemary languish far from home." When Joe had a stroke in 1961, Eunice brought Rosemary back into the family and began to pressure her brother to initiate policies for intellectual disabilities. President Kennedy, with strong support from his sister Eunice Kennedy Shriver, brought intellectual disabilities out of the shadows and into the public light. The Kennedy family had a personal connection to the issue. The president's sister Rosemary, 16 months his junior, was born with intellectual disabilities. President Kennedy and his family forever changed public attitudes toward people with intellectual disabilities. Their influence on related policies and programs can still be seen today. In the 20 years following the Kennedy administration, Congress passed 116 acts or amendments providing support for people with intellectual disabilities and their families. Her sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, was determined to change the narrative. Inspired by Rosemary's experience, Eunice founded the Special Olympics in 1968, a revolutionary act that promoted the dignity, potential, and inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities around the world. In parallel, the Kennedy family's advocacy led to the creation of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development in 1962. Part of the National Institutes of Health, NICHD has been a global leader in research on pregnancy outcomes, child development, and infant brain injuries. Eunice Shriver said in her eulogy that Rosemary had left a legacy that was long and deep. Along with inspiring Mrs. Shriver's own work with Special Olympics, Rosemary had inspired her brother, President John F. Kennedy, to initiate sweeping legislation designed to improve the quality of life for Americans with disabilities. She had inspired her sister Jean Kennedy Smith to start Very Special Arts and her nephew Anthony Shriver to start Best Buddies. She founded the movement that became Special Olympics, the largest movement for acceptance and inclusion for people with intellectual disabilities in the history of the world. Her work transformed the lives of hundreds of millions of people across the globe, and they in turn are her living legacy. What began as one woman's vision evolved into Special Olympics International, a global movement that today serves over 4.6 million athletes and unified partners in 208 countries and jurisdictions. Global Day of Inclusion, Eunice Kennedy Shriver Day, is an annual celebration of her life and a global call challenging everyone to choose to include. This invitation stems from Mrs. Shriver's teaching that on the playing field, we forget about our differences and recognize our mutual humanity. For my mother, this was activism wrapped up with sports, faith, and social justice, her way of attacking the pain and rejection that had marred Rosemary's life and hers. Writes Tim Shriver in his book, Fully Alive, Discovering What Matters Most. She was a camp director on a mission, and somewhere within her was Rosemary, a sister, calling out for a chance. And what of Rosemary herself? What happened to the woman at the center of all this tragedy and transformation? Kennedy died from natural causes on January 7, 2005, aged 86, at the Fort Atkinson Memorial Hospital in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, with her siblings, sisters Jean, Eunice, and Patricia, and brother Ted by her side. The lobotomy performed on Rosemary Kennedy left her permanently incapacitated, unable to walk or speak properly, and her cognitive abilities severely impacted. Rosemary was sent to an institution in Wisconsin called St. Coletta's, where she spent the next 60 years of her life. While she was initially isolated from her siblings and extended family following her lobotomy, she did go on to visit them during her later life. Rosemary Kennedy lived for 86 years. She spent 64 of those years in institutional care, away from the life she might have had. But in the end, her siblings were there. In the end, the family that had hidden her away came back to hold her hand. Rosemary Kennedy represented at once a family tragedy and an opportunity to prevent such tragedies from happening in the future. We are just coming out of the dark ages in our handling of this serious national problem, her sister wrote. The solutions Shriver outlined included deinstitutionalization, campaigns against public prejudice, and invigorated scientific research. Shriver also called on our fellow citizens to consider the abilities of children and adults with mental retardation rather than only their disabilities, and incorporate them into every aspect of community life, from education and work to recreation. In later years, this vision would be called normalization. Rosemary Kennedy herself was unable to benefit, but she became an important symbol of changing ideas about developmental disability in the United States. Rosemary's story still resonates today because it shows us, on the one hand, how much we as a culture have evolved in regards to the education, treatment, and accommodation of people with disabilities and mental illness, and on the other, the struggles that the disabled and their families still face. Rosemary's life was marred by horrific tragedy, and it is within that story of heartbreak and pain that readers will find an enduring image of a loving young woman who changed her family forever. Rosemary Kennedy was one of approximately 50,000 victims of lobotomy in the United States. 50,000 people, 50,000 lives altered, damaged, destroyed by a procedure that was eventually recognized as one of modern medicine's greatest failures. Rosemary Kennedy was one of them, but her story didn't end with the operating table. Her story transformed into something larger than herself. Author Elizabeth Kohler-Pentecoff noted that despite the strides made by the Kennedy family in the decades following Rosemary's lobotomy, the job of advocating for people with disabilities is far from done. We need to listen, she said. Listen when people with disabilities speak, and make a place for their voices in your life. In the shadow of Rosemary's legacy, it's up to us to prevent those voices from ever being silenced again. And so we return to where we began. A young woman, beautiful and full of life, born into a family destined for greatness. A father who saw her as a problem to be solved, a medical procedure that promised a cure but delivered devastation. Decades of silence and shame, and then, finally, redemption, not for Rosemary herself, who never recovered what was taken from her, but for millions of others who would benefit from her suffering. Rosemary Kennedy never got to speak for herself. She never got to tell her own story. She never got to explain how it felt to be the Kennedy who didn't fit, the Kennedy who was too different, the Kennedy who was surgically silenced so her brothers could rise to power without the burden of her existence. But her life spoke louder than any words could have. Her suffering ignited a movement. Her absence created a presence that changed the world. That's Rosemary's legacy. If there's a tragedy, there's also this incredible outcome. The way that they were able to affect change for millions of people around this country and around the world. Today, when you see a Special Olympics athlete cross a finish line, when you see someone with an intellectual disability working alongside their colleagues, when you see a child with special needs included in a classroom rather than hidden away in an institution, you are seeing Rosemary Kennedy's legacy. She was silenced. But through her silence, millions found their voices. She was hidden away. But her story brought intellectual disabilities into the light. She was deemed a problem to be fixed, but she became the reason the world started seeing people with disabilities as human beings deserving of dignity, respect, and opportunity. Rosemary Kennedy never got to live the life she deserved, but because of her, countless others have. And perhaps that is the most powerful truth of all that. Even in our darkest moments, even when everything is taken from us, our lives can still matter. Our suffering can still have meaning. Our stories can still change the world. Rosemary Kennedy's story is not just a Kennedy tragedy. It is a reminder of how far we have come and how far we still have to go. It is a call to see the humanity in everyone, especially those who are different. It is a testament to the power of one life, even a life that was deliberately erased to transform history. She was the hidden Kennedy daughter, but she was never forgotten. And now, finally, the world knows her name.